The following is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, a free online PvP strategy game where you choose a real-world country to lead during World War III. Fight against up to 128 other players in real-time games that can take weeks to complete, using a variety of units, from tanks to jets to nuclear submarines and cruise missiles. Declare wars and engage in epic battles to take over the world, or forge alliances with other players. The game is cross-platform and available on both PC and mobile, and it can be played on both platforms with just a single account. If you use the unique link in the description below, you can get an exclusive bonus, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days however, so make sure to sign up fast and get in the fight. By the end of the 1970s, it had become clear that the war in Rhodesia was entering its endgame. Both the Rhodesian security forces and the rebels were carrying out increasingly dramatic attacks. Zandler was striking downtown Salisbury and had wiped out a quarter of the country's fuel reserve in a single attack, while Zipra had downed 2 civilian airliners within months of each other. The Rhodesians, now officially Zimbabwe Rhodesia, had carried out token reforms. The country had a new black prime minister, Abel Muzorewa, and a new flag to go along with the new name. But militarily, they too were continuing to ramp up their actions, increasing the scope and scale of their externals, operations outside of Rhodesian borders, striking at rebel bases in Mozambique and Zambia, and now on occasion even engaging in combat with government forces from the two countries. Even as feelers were put out to bring about a negotiated end to the war, in the run-up to the Commonwealth Heads of State meeting in Lusaka, the fighting continued. Even continuing as talks began at Lancaster House in London a month later. Both sides saw increasing their efforts on the battlefields of southern Africa as necessary in order to give themselves the best possible negotiating position in London. In a year that saw an amphibious assault, 2 major combined arms offensives, trench fighting and armoured warfare, somehow the most audacious operation was carried out by less than 24 men and in complete secrecy, and its name was Operation Cheese. Around the middle of 1979, the Rhodesian SAS had begun experimenting with airdropping large palletized loads alongside combined freefall and static line parachute drops. The loads were about 8 feet by 4 feet, and it was speculated at the time that they were experimenting with airdropping a vehicle of some sort for long-range operations. For this, though, they had only one aircraft available, the DC-7. The Rhodesian Air Force's DC-7F was actually a loaner from the company Air Trans-Africa, and flown by squadron leader George Alexander and co-piloted by the aircraft's owner, World War II veteran, Congo mercenary, Biafran gunrunner, smuggler and sanction buster Jack Mallock. The DC-7 was beloved to him, and despite it getting a bit old-fashioned for the rest of the world, it was completely at home in Africa. Originally configured with a refrigerated hold for smuggling Rhodesian beef into Gabon, when used by the Rhodesian Air Force, it had temporary seating installed for up to 40 men, and the rear hatch was removed to allow for a smooth exit from the aircraft. The practice jumps would continue for months until early September. In addition, the DC-7 began being sent on a number of reconnaissance flights into Zambia, under the guise of regular air cargo flights. Then, on the night of the 12th, the DC-7 took off with a 4-man SAS team, only for them to return hours later, their mission having been called off. On the 25th, with the personnel assigned to the mystery operation reworked, a warning order was given to prepare for a series of training jumps to be followed by an external operation. Between the jumps, 2 of the men were tasked with modelling 2 bridges, while the rest of the men signed out demolitions equipment, canoes, a Zodiac assault boat, and other materials necessary for demolishing a bridge. 2 of the jumps were carried out on the 26th, and then 2 on the morning of the 27th, both from DC-3s. Then, on the afternoon of the 27th, the 16 men assigned to the operation and a small support team left Cabrit Barracks near Salisbury for a security sterile site near Darwindale Dam, some 30 kilometres to the west of the city. The security sterile site turned out to be an old farmhouse now belonging to the Rhodesian government. The men were taken into a makeshift briefing room, and finally given their task by Major Graham Wilson, who would be leading the operation. They were to be dropped nearly 800 kilometres away into Zambia, in order to take out the Tazara railway bridge, a nearby road bridge over the Chambeshi River. The raid would be farther than any Rhodesian troops had ever operated before. So far, in fact, that the SAS couldn't even provide reliable maps. The Tazara Railway had only been in operation for just under 4 years, and despite its problems, it had been a major propaganda victory for Zambia and the anti-Rhodesia South Africa frontline states. Prior to its completion, Zambia's only economic lifeline had been the Lusaka-Bulawayo section of the Cape to Cairo Railway, which connected to ports in Mozambique and South Africa. After Rhodesia had declared independence in 1965, all passenger trains on the line had been stopped and cargo halted. Though in time cargo trains would be started, halted, restarted, and halted over and over again, repeatedly as relations between the two nations and Zambia's economic hardships fluctuated. It had been critical for the Zambians to be on good terms with the Rhodesians, in order to not only bring in revenue by exporting copper ore, the country's primary export, but also to enable the importation of maize and fertilizer which they desperately needed. The lack of any other alternative had given Rhodesia a massive amount of power over Zambia, and it had proven more than once that it was willing to put its neighbour under economic blockade in order to exert control over its policies. Most critically, Zambia's support for ZIPRA. After the project was turned down by the West as making no economic sense, the Tazara Railway had been finished with the help of the Chinese government. Not only did it half the cost of freight shipping to ship through Tanzania, it meant that Zambia was protected from future Rhodesian blockades. And with the end of the war in sight, and Rhodesia needing all the influence it could get, the bridges had to go. The operation was to be carried out in 4 stages. Stage 1, a 4-man threefold team made up of Major Graham Wilson, Lieutenant Phil Cook, Sergeant Paul French, and Lance Corporal Stan Standish White, would make a high-altitude jump into Zambia about 40 kilometers from the bridge. Wilson, Cook, and Standish White had all been on the original team for the cancelled 12 September attempt. The 4 men were designated the Light Group and would advance to the bridges by night via canoe and confirm the layout, size, and materials of the bridge before withdrawing back to the drop zone for Step 2. Step 2 had 12 more men, led by Captain Bob Mackenzie and designated the Heavy Group, carry out a static line drop to join the Light Group. The Heavy Group would be bringing with them all the materials required to actually carry out the demolition. After linking up, the 2 groups would once again advance to the bridge at night via canoe and Zodiac boat and establish a line-up position. Step 3 was to finally move out and demolish the railway bridge and the accompanying road bridge. Finally, Step 4 was the getaway. A suitable vehicle or vehicles would have to be stolen or hijacked to allow all 16 men to make their escape. Then they were to drive south until they reached the South Luangwa National Park, find a suitable site to be picked up by Air Force helicopters, prepare a landing site without being detected, and make it out of the country once picked up. Despite the titles, both groups would be carrying a massive amount of equipment for the raid. Each man would be carrying 10 days of rations, 5 days of water, their rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, batteries, emergency survival kit, webbing, sleeping bags, ground sheets, shelter sheets, camp stoves, knives, notebooks, torches, civilian clothing, and any additional specialist equipment depending on the man. Both groups would also be dropping with a separate crate or crates containing the heaviest items. For the light group, it would contain 2 canoes, paddles, spare long-range radio, 2 spare handheld radios, ammunition, food and water. For the heavy group, it would contain the same, but with more canoes, the inflatable Zodiac assault boat, and the silenced outboard motor and fuel. The total weight each man carried was so much, in fact, that despite some of the SAS men saying it was a realistic load, the parachute dispatchers, Chief Dispatcher Frank Hales, and dispatchers Kevin Milligan and Mark Duffy, all had to physically help the parachutists onto the feet and to the door of the aircraft before the jumps. Over the following days, the training continued practically around the clock. Paddling around on Lake Robertson in their canoes, the men practiced the demolition using half-submerged buildings as stand-ins, and trying out new techniques that hadn't yet been used in anger. Around 8 o'clock on the night of the 29th, they carried out their only dress rehearsal for the real thing. Loading up at the DC-7 at New Sarum Air Base, the aircraft came in over the lake at 12,000 feet. Loner it would be for the real thing, but it meant the men didn't have to pack oxygen. Over the drop zone, the crate was pushed out and followed by the light group. All appeared to go well, except for Lieutenant Cook, whose main parachute failed, and he then got to set the record as the only Rhodesian serviceman to make a successful reserve parachute landing at night. While the light team were making it safely to the ground, the aircraft circled around and descended. Guided in by the men now on the ground, the heavy group made their static line drop, and again, with no issues except for one minor inconvenience, when Captain Mackenzie landed in the shallows, a bit damp but safe. While final touches were put in place, the drop zone near the bridges had to be confirmed in person. So on the night of the 2nd October, Wilson and Milligan climbed aboard a Rhodesian Air Force Canberra jet bomber in order to get some photographs to help guide in the DC-7 on the night. All went smoothly. The Rhodesian Air Force at this stage was no stranger to flying reconnaissance missions over Zambia in secret, and so this job was simply a matter of routine. Flying at 30,000 feet, dropped to 15 over the target, Wilson and Milligan got a good look at the bridges and the area surrounding and took some reference photos. On their return, it was agreed that it was time to bring down the bridges. On the evening of the 3rd, the light group was given their final briefing. They carried out an extensive equipment check and spent time on the firing range to ensure the weapons functioned. Then they were taken back to New Sarum and told to wait in the parachute school out of sight. In the DC-7, Duffy prepared the oxygen supply while Milligan, now chief dispatcher while Hales was away, went over the plan, taping the photographs he had taken in the Canberra next to the door, so that he could alternate between them and the view outside the doorway. When the time came, the light team were quickly bundled into the back of a truck, along with the pilots Alexander and Malik, and the 6 were driven to the far end of the runway where the DC-7 had been parked out of sight. At 11:30, the airliner took off towards Zambia. They flew at 18,000 feet and followed the usual air lane used by freight services heading towards Tanzania. If the tower at the airport in Lusaka spotted them, then they would appear to be just another regular cargo flight. The 6 men in the back sat in silence, oxygen masks on and wrapped in blankets to combat the chill of the empty refrigerated hold. Once the plane began descending to 15,000 feet for the drop, they began to move, being helped into their kit by Duffy and Milligan before they moved on to positioning the crate in their hatchway. At 15,000 feet, there was practically no visibility, and Alexander was flying solely on instruments. Despite his insistence that they were over the target, Milligan refused to okay the jump until he caught sight of the drop zone. Milligan and Wilson agreed on bringing the aircraft down to 12,000 feet, and Alexander brought the plane around hard and they attempted another run. Again, there was no sign of the river that could be used as a guide, but once again, Alexander insisted that they were over the target, but Milligan still refused. Alexander had a reputation as being punchy, but this drop was Milligan's first as chief dispatcher, and he was taking no chances. Milligan and Wilson agreed on one more attempt at 8,000 feet. Any lower, and it was almost guaranteed that someone on the ground would raise the alarm. Standish White would later recall that by this point he had forgotten all about the circling. He was so shit-scared that it wasn't surprising. Despite the growing discomfort, Wilson agreed with Milligan's decision. He later said the oxygen was a pain, standing in the door holding the mask as we circled ready to ditch it, with my back breaking due to the heavy pack. They made their last approach, but again, nothing. Finally, Milligan called off the jump. Much to Alexander's disappointment, he gave the bad news to Wilson, no go, but as he did, something caught his eye outside. He leaned out again, began pointing and shouting so loud that the whole team could hear over the engines, and then gave the order to jump. The crate was heaved out the door, and the light team waddled as fast as they could in their oversized packs to make it out after it. Operation Cheese was finally underway. It was 1:30 in the morning, 4th October. It wasn't a textbook jump by any means. My exit was horrendous, our group was pretty messy, and the box just thundered down, recalled Standish White. But nevertheless, they were quickly on the ground. French tried to follow the crate down, searching for the white cross sewn into the top of the canopy, but had no luck finding it. Once on the ground, they quickly hid the parachutes by whatever means, including stuffing them down aardvark dens, drew the weapons, and regrouped. Wilson radioed into the DC-7 and gave Malik the all-clear to turn back towards home. With the light team now alone in Zambia, they realised that no one had actually seen the crate come down under a parachute, and Wilson set off on a search with another man, while French began sending a status report through to headquarters via Morse code, to inform them that they'd made it to the ground, no casualties on landing. But they had lost the crate. Eventually, Wilson returned with the bad news. There was no sign of the crate. This meant that they were without the canoes, and now they'd have to walk the nearly 100 kilometers to the bridge and back. The one upside was that their decision to bring along a spare long-range radio had been validated, and they were still in contact with headquarters. The daylight hours of the 4th would be spent laying low, making sure they hadn't been spotted and no search party was coming after them, and also spent searching for the crate once again, though again without any luck. At 6 o'clock, they checked in with headquarters and reported no issues other than the missing crate. The process of setting up the radio and antenna, sending the message, and taking it all down again only took French about 2 minutes. Then, that night, the walking began. It wouldn't be pleasant, but they were all well trained and well experienced in that sort of thing, and they got on with it without grumbling. Back at MajorSamm, they finally received the bad news, and the decision was made to delay the follow-up jump. The light group reached the area of the bridges on the 6th. They'd spent 2 nights crossing smaller rivers and dodging isolated villages. They established a lying-up position, and while French stayed behind to stand guard, the other 3 stripped down and swam to the bridges. They took measurements of the dimensions and confirmed the materials and construction of the bridge, finding that they matched both the intelligence estimate and the scale model. They also discovered that the bridge was protected by only a single armed guard. Rather pleased with themselves, they returned to the LUP. A report was sent back to headquarters confirming their information, and they scheduled the heavy group's parachute drop. Once the messages had been sent, the walk back began. While the light team had been waiting for nightfall on the 6th, Milligan and Duffy had been ordered to report to Fylde Airfield. Fylde was usually quiet. Then, during an external, it would gain a lot of activity all at once before settling down again. What went on during these bursts of activity was usually kept secret, and neither Milligan nor Duffy really knew anything about the place. They arrived to find sat on the runway a South African Air Force C-130. Somehow, South Africans had caught wind of Cheese, and they wanted in on the action. Keeping Zambia under control was just as much in the South African interest as it was in the Rhodesian interest. The South African captain, Gardner, had under his command a crew twice the size that of the DC-7, a co-pilot, specialist navigators, flight engineers, 2 loadmasters, and 2 dispatchers. They would see to it that this time everything made it to the ground safely, which was just as well as they had 6 canoes, the Zodiac, and about a ton of demolitions equipment to drop alongside the heavy group, as well as supplies for the light group. Over the next 24 hours, the heavy group and the now mixed air crew carried out 2 practice drops, and dropping crates from the rear ramp of the C-130 at 600 feet. All went well, and at 11:30 on the 7th, the C-130 took off for Zambia. The ride was much more comfortable, and they could cruise at altitude without needing oxygen masks. At 1 a.m. on the 8th, they came in low, 600 feet just like the training jumps, and Wilson guided them in over the radio. The heavy group jumped first and landed without incident. Then the C-130 came around again, and this time 4 crates were rolled off the rear. All 4 parachutes deployed, and they all landed just about spot on in front of the assembling heavy group. The C-130 turned around and was back at Fylde by 3 a.m. The next morning, it was back in South Africa like it never left. The rest of the night was spent unpacking and camouflaging the equipment and disposing of the packaging and parachutes, after which the men tried to get some shut-eye. During the early morning, smoke was sighted in the distance. Assumed to be a small bushfire, the sentries didn't raise the alarm. Then, at 3 p.m, they realised a second fire had sprung up, and it was quickly burning towards them. While Wilson and Mackenzie made a plan, they began hearing voices closing in. Their first thought was that they'd been spotted, and working under that assumption, they quietly raised the alarm, and the 16 men spread out into a defence. Not long after, with the fire within 100 metres, the sources of the voices appeared. Not a group of Zambian police, but instead a group of hunters wielding spears. Still, they were closing in, and the Rhodesians couldn't risk being seen, so the men laid in wait until the hunters had passed. By a massive stroke of luck, an animal broke out of the underbrush, and darted in the opposite direction, redirecting the hunters away from the hidden men. They would have breathed a sigh of relief, if not for the fire still encroaching on their stash of explosives. For the next hour, the men carried and hid their equipment in a new position, while the others tried to slow down the fire. Once everything of value had been moved to a safe distance, they let the fire reach the crates and parachutes and dispose of the evidence. With this all done, the men once again tried to get some rest before nightfall. While they laid in wait, one of the hunters came back to where they'd been previously hidden, went rooting around in the ashes, and retrieved a small animal. Happy, he didn't look any closer, and walked away once again. Once darkness came, they once again had to move all their equipment 400 metres to the riverbank. Even with 16 men, it still took a couple of hours to move it all, and then over 30 minutes to catch the breath. At midnight, they finally had the boats loaded up and were on their way to the bridges. However, military intelligence had made a small error when going over the photographs of the area. They'd estimated, based on the appearance of the river, that it flowed at about 11 kilometers per hour. But the men in the boats found it to be about double that in reality, and the men, two to a canoe, strained under their equipment to make a consistent 4 kilometers an hour against it. After a slow start, the column went ashore around daybreak to lay low once again. The next night, another problem arose, as they entered a series of rapids not on the maps. There, the struggle got worse. Aboard the Zodiac, they were so badly weighed down that controlling it through the rapids was nearly impossible. Most of the crew's effort was spent just trying to keep the Zodiac from rolling over as they were thrown around, and eventually they were sent spinning back downstream. The men in the canoes were so focused on their own ordeals that they were completely unawares that they'd left them behind. Once they regained control, the decision was made to dump one of the 50-kilogram chargers overboard to lessen the weight, and then try again to beat the rapids. Once again, they were forced back down the river spinning. Third time, however, was the charm, and they made it through, only to be met with a new problem as the engine broke down. They landed on the river's edge, and one of the men, Vosloo, stripped down and cleaned the engine, and then drained the fuel tank, separating the fuel from the river water, and got the whole lot working again. By the end of the third night on the river, the 10th going into the 11th of October, they were within a kilometre of the bridge. Once again, the daylight hours were spent in a laying up position, and as darkness approached, the 16 men began their final preparations. Wilson and Mackenzie went over each team's tasks. 4 men would pull security, deal with the guard, and later stop a vehicle to use in the getaway. Another 4 men would secure a rope around the railway bridge's central pillars for the 4 men in the Zodiac to secure themselves to. The final 4 men would fix mounting points to the central pillars for the Zodiac team to attach the demolition charges to. All of this would be duplicated on the road bridge. At 10 o'clock, the boat set off towards the railway bridge as a storm brewed. With perfect timing, as they rounded the last bend in the river 300 meters from the bridge, a ripple of lightning illuminated the entire area, including all the men on the river. Luckily, however, the guard didn't see anything. The entire process of preparing the bridges for demolition went like clockwork, the men all having carried out the motions over and over again on Lake Robertson. This was, however, the first time some of the techniques had been used in anger. For example, the use of a special superglue, kept in 2 plastic bottles. When mixed together, the men only had about 10 seconds to coat and mount the 12-inch wooden plates that the explosive charges would attach to. Also a new technique was the use of explosive nets. All the explosives being laid were just below the surface of the water to maximize the force against the bridge's pillars. But to get every last bit of power they could, they would also be using a web of explosive cortex that was placed on the opposite side of the pillars and detonated a fraction of a second before the main charges. The shockwave of the net and the force of the water would force almost the entire force of the blast into the pillar, as opposed to dissipating outwards. This, as well as the PE4 cutting charges used on the spans, were all connected to a single continuous line of detonating cord called the ring main. As a failsafe, the ring main was duplicated, and the 2 mains were connected to 2 initiation sets. The men weren't leaving anything to chance. While the men below the bridge worked on the demolition, things up top weren't going quite to plan. First, 2 of the men were spotted by the guard, armed with a shotgun, who ordered them to come out into the open. Instead, the SAS men opened fire with suppressed pistols, and the guard fled into the bush. With the guard dealt with, the next task was to stop a suitable vehicle if the opportunity arose. The men produced a Zambian police barrier used at checkpoints and placed it in the road and waited. Not too long after, 2 Mercedes trucks approached the makeshift checkpoint. The men waved the first through and then stopped the second, directing it to pull to the side of the road, while one of the men replaced the barriers with breakdown triangles. They forced the driver and the co-driver from the cab and found that the driver was in fact an Irishman. As they questioned him, the first truck returned to check on what the delay was. As it turned out, it too was driven by an Irishman, the brother of the driver of the second truck. But before they could deal with this development, a third truck arrived at the scene, it too driven by a brother of the first 2, and this time it was accompanied by his son and his son's friend, who had tagged along on the trip because it was his son's 10th birthday. So now they had to deal with 7 hostages, the 3 Irish brothers, their 2 black co-drivers, and the 2 kids. They couldn't let them go because they might report the sabotage, They couldn't leave them on the bridge because there was a chance they'd be killed by the explosion, or be picked up and have it blamed on them by the Zambian police. And they couldn't just make them disappear because they were under orders forbidding it. The decision was made to just bring all the hostages along with them. The second truck was picked to transport them all, and they unloaded all of what turned out to be sacks of fertilizer, except for the outermost layer which would act as cover. The Irishman insisted on driving, as it turned out he was the owner-operator of what turned out to be his brand new truck, and Wilson and Mackenzie rode up front alongside him. The last man started the timer on the ring main, ran across the bridge, and climbed into the back of the truck. They made it through the town of Chembeshi with no issues, even driving directly past the town's police station. On the far side of town, about 20 kilometers from the bridge, two men dismounted and cut the telephone lines into the town, isolating it from the rest of the country. At 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, roughly 15 minutes after the timer had been set, as the men prepared to climb back into the truck, a flash lit up the horizon, and they heard the sound of both bridges going up in smoke. The truck carried on south. While the driver had obviously been rattled by the hijacking, and at first had repeatedly asked if he and his family would be harmed, to which Wilson and Mackenzie had assured him they wouldn't, by the time they were closing in on Pika, the only other large town on the route, the driver was actively helping them, telling them about various obstacles in the way, and which would be the best route to take them to the national park where they'd be extracted. He even managed to navigate them around in Pika, so that they'd avoid the authorities completely. By daybreak, they were on the road leading into South Luangwa National Park, and the most dangerous part of the drive was behind them. Wilson ordered a halt, and French set up his radio to contact headquarters. 100% success. A Canberra was sent out to assess the damage, and the SAS men continued on the way. As they drove through the wilderness, they passed through countless small communities where people would stand at the side of the road and wave to the truck as it passed, but no one seemed concerned by the sight of the men. Possibly because from the outside, the two SAS men with their faces still blacked with camouflage gave the appearance that the white driver was accompanied by two Africans. Regardless, they played it cool and returned the waves. They kept on going through the morning, and they put civilization behind them as they approached the end of the road. Their plan was to make the most of the truck and use it to carve a path through the bush when the track ran out. What they didn't plan for, however, was to come face to face with a power station that far out in the middle of nowhere as they approached the end of the road. The truck was hastily pulled off into the undergrowth, while Wilson and Mackenzie went over the maps to decide what to do. Where they were was most likely the Lusawasi power station, so at least it meant they were practically on the doorstep of the national park, which was the only good news about the situation. The bad news was that they'd been spotted, and at 10 a.m, while the rest of the men were crouched in the underbrush brewing up some tea, they heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. They scattered and got themselves into cover as a Land Rover approached and stopped where the truck had gone off-road. Half a dozen guards began poking around, and one of the SAS men called out to them, either to try and dissuade them or to entice one of them to investigate in order to take them hostage. But either way, it didn't work, and when one of the guards turned back to raise the alarm, a firefight broke out. In short order, 4 of the 6 were dead, and the 2 survivors were fleeing. The call was made to immediately go off-road, much to the chagrin of the driver, and make a dash for whatever possible landing site they could find. They ploughed their way through rocks and gullies and knocked down more than a few small trees, doing what they called bundu bashing. Eventually, in the late afternoon, they decided they could go no further now that they were in practically untouched wilderness. They were still some 250 to 300 kilometers away from the Rhodesian border, but it was still close enough to call in the cheetahs. They signalled for a pickup and were told it would arrive at 0800 the next morning, the 13th. The rest of daylight was spent trying to clear a big enough area to land a helicopter on, and then they established a perimeter. They had some food which they shared with the hostages and settled in for the night. The next morning, they made the final preparations, using the truck to clear out some trees, much to the continued dismay of the driver, and then they waited. The Rhodesian Air Force cheetahs set off that morning from New Sarum, refueled at Mount Darwin, and then once again at the Musongezi mission, where they also picked up extra fuel drums to keep themselves topped up as they went, refueling themselves in flight. Once they're around 15 kilometers out, Wilson kept his radio on continuously as they closed in on their position. And as they came into sight, the hostages began to once again get nervous, thinking surely now they were either going to get left behind or shot. Instead, they were loaded up alongside the SAS, and within 15 minutes of their approach, the helicopters were refueled, the drums discarded, and they were in the air once again, heading back towards Rhodesia. stopping at the Musangezi mission for a refuel for a second time that day, and then heading back to New Sarum and the Kabrit barracks. As they approached landing, the hostages had pillowcases placed over their heads, and on arrival were taken away by the intelligence services. The men disembarked and were quickly debriefed before they left to get cleaned up and go home. A few days later, the freefall team met with Malik for a celebratory drink. He admitted he never expected to see him again. Elsewhere, Milligan met with Frank Hales, back from leave, who asked him how things had gone. On what, Milligan had asked. Op cheese. Oh, Milligan replied. Piece of cake. The destruction the Chambeshi bridges immediately stranded 10,000 tons of copper ore in Zambia and almost 20,000 tons of goods in Tanzania, including supplies of maize needed to prevent a famine. It took at least 3 months to rebuild the road bridge and 6 months for the railway bridge, again with the help of the Chinese government. It took a further 10 years to restore traffic to the 1978 levels. It's hard to say what the political gains of Operation Cheese were, as the war ended only a few months later. The hostages were taken to a safe house in Salisbury and debriefed, after which negotiations began through the British consulate in South Africa to ensure their safety once they were returned to Zambia. This took months as the Zambians were convinced that they must have been in on the plan. Negotiations went on so long, in fact, that the Rhodesian government had to employ a teacher solely for the 2 boys to keep up their education. Eventually, they were all flown back to Lusaka, immediately imprisoned, and then released again. 2 of the brothers continue to live in Zambia to this day, the third emigrated to Australia, and the son returned to Ireland. The Rhodesian SAS tried to replicate their success in Mozambique, in an operation that started the same day as the first operation returned from Zambia. This time, they managed to blow up 2 of the 3 targeted bridges, before the third team was driven back by a swarm of angry bees. But that's a story for another time. Thank you for listening to another relatively unknown episode of Military History. This one was an odd one to dig into with all its twists and turns, and I hope everyone who made it this far has enjoyed it. Thanks also to the patrons, who have stuck around despite my slow progress on these videos. Finally, thanks again to the sponsor of this video, Conflict of Nations, the 3 online PvP strategy game. Remember that you can use the unique link in the description below to get an exclusive bonus. 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days though, so get going.